Sometimes the greatest treasures are buried beneath what others call worthless. For 40 years, a rotting sternwheeler called the Mudlark sat stuck in riverbank mud, a monument to decay that every riverman ignored. When Elias River Rat Cole spent his last $2 on that condemned wreck, the waterfront laughed. They called him a fool, betting on how long before the boat collapsed and buried him. But Elias wasn't chasing glory, he just needed scrap iron to survive. What he found instead, hidden beneath 40 years of sludge in a secret smuggler's hold, would turn the dock's laughingstock into the man who owned them all. What treasure lay concealed in that rotting hull that no one thought to look for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Mississippi River town of Cypress Landing had seen better days, though you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who remembered them. The docks stretched along the muddy waterfront like rotting teeth, weathered pilings leaning at angles that defied explanation. Morning fog rolled in thick as cotton, carrying the smell of river silt and yesterday's fish. It was the kind of place where ambition came to die, where men grew old watching the same brown water flow past, year after year, carrying dreams downstream to somewhere else. Elias Cole had lived on these docks for 63 years, and for most of that time he'd been invisible. Not the kind of invisible that comes from being unremarkable, though he was that too, but the kind that comes from being so thoroughly a part of the scenery that folks forgot you were human at all. He lived in a tar paper shack wedged between the old cotton warehouse and the fish packing shed, a structure so humble it didn't rate a street number. Just River Rat's Place, if anyone bothered to mention it. The nickname had stuck since he was 12. Some boys get called worse things and shake them off, but Elias never minded. River rats were survivors after all. They found a way to make do when everyone else gave up. They lived in the spaces nobody wanted, ate what others threw away, and kept going when circumstances said they shouldn't. His father had worked the steamboats back when the river still mattered, before the railroads choked the life out of the shipping trade. Thomas Cole had been a deckhand on the Belle of Memphis, then the River Queen, then a succession of smaller and shabbier boats as the glory days faded. He died when a cargo winch snapped, taking half the cargo and 3 good men into the brown water. Elias was 14 then, and the shipping company gave his mother $12 for her trouble and told her to clear out of company housing by Sunday. They'd moved into the tar paper shack that very afternoon. It had been abandoned for years, home to nothing but rats and river spiders, but it had a roof and walls and nobody asking for rent. Elias's mother took in washing and mending, her hands cracked and raw from lye soap, while Elias did whatever work the docks would throw his way, hauling, gutting fish, mucking out the stables where the draft horses waited between shifts. Any honest labor that paid in coins or bread. She'd lasted 8 more years before the cough took her. By then, Elias had learned every trick of survival the riverfront could teach. He knew which shop owners threw out bread that was only a day stale, which fishermen would trade yesterday's catch for help mending nets, which saloon kept a pot of beans going in the back for anyone who'd sweep the floor. He knew how to stretch $1 until it screamed, how to patch boots with scraps of leather and tar, how to make a winter coat last another season with careful stitching and layers of newspaper for insulation. The docks knew him as a man you could hire for odd jobs, the ones nobody else wanted. If you needed someone to climb into a grain hopper and shovel out the moldy corners, you called River Rat. If a barge needed scraping below the waterline, he'd strap on hip waders and do it for half what anyone else charged. He fixed leaky roofs with salvaged tin, hauled away trash for pennies, and never complained about the work being beneath him because he'd never fooled himself into thinking he was above anything. The other men on the waterfront tolerated him the way you tolerate a stray dog, useful enough to keep around, not important enough to notice when he wasn't there. They'd share a smoke with him during lunch breaks, trade jokes about the shipping company bosses, but nobody invited him home for Sunday dinner. He existed in that comfortable middle distance where a man could be known without being seen, acknowledged without being included. Marcus Webb ran the Cyprus Landing Shipping Company from an office that overlooked the docks like a throne room. He was third-generation wealth, the grandson of a man who'd made a fortune moving cotton downriver before the war. The war had complicated things. Fortunes were lost, allegiances questioned, property seized and returned, and seized again, but the Webbs had survived by being just flexible enough in their loyalties to stay afloat. By the time Marcus took over, the glory days were long past, but enough remained to keep him comfortable in a way Elias would never understand. Marcus employed most of the men on these docks, and he knew it. He paid low wages, kept the work irregular enough that nobody could count on a steady income, and ruled through a careful balance of occasional generosity and constant threat. He'd been known to fire a man for looking at him wrong, but he'd also been known to slip an extra $1 to a worker whose child was sick. It kept everyone off balance, always trying to stay in his good graces, always aware that their livelihood hung on his whim. He had particular contempt for Elias. Maybe it was because Elias had never asked for favors, never groveled, never seemed to care whether Marcus noticed him or not. Or maybe it was simply that Elias represented everything Marcus feared, becoming a man with nothing, surviving on scraps, proof that all the money and power in the world couldn't completely insulate you from the knowledge that circumstances could change, that you could end up forgotten. There were others on the docks, of course. Jimmy Potts, who'd lost 3 fingers to a cargo hook and now worked the scales at the fish market, weighing catches with hands that shook from too much whiskey. Sarah Brennan, who sold coffee and hard rolls from a cart every morning, her voice hoarse from decades of shouting prices over the noise of the waterfront. Old Silas, who'd been ancient when Elias was a boy and somehow kept getting older, sitting on the same piling every day, watching the river with eyes that had seen steamboat races and cargo wars and the slow death of a way of life. These were Elias's people, though he'd never presumed to call them friends. They inhabited the same world of scarcity and stubborn endurance, the same narrow margins between getting by and going under. They understood without saying that life was hard and getting harder, that the river didn't care about your struggles, that tomorrow would be pretty much like today unless something dramatic happened. And nothing dramatic ever happened in Cyprus Landing anymore. The mud lark had been part of the scenery for so long that most people under 40 had never seen it any other way. It sat 300 yards downriver from the main docks, driven into the bank by a flood back in 1825. The current had wedged it at an angle, bow pointing downstream, stern shoved deep into the mud. Over the decades, silt had built up around it, turning it into part of the landscape. Willow saplings grew through the deck, their roots cracking the planking. The paddle wheel had long since rotted away, leaving only the iron framework like the skeleton of some ancient beast. She'd been a stern-wheeler packet boat once, running mail and passengers between Memphis and New Orleans. Not a glamorous vessel, working boats rarely were, but solid and reliable in her day. The war had complicated her service like it complicated everything. Boats were commandeered, cargo seized, routes disrupted. By the time the shooting stopped, river traffic had changed. Railroads were spreading like iron weeds, offering faster, more reliable service. The old packet routes dried up, and boats like the Mudlark became obsolete overnight. Someone had tried to salvage her back in the 1,830 seconds, but the effort failed when they discovered the hull had settled too deep into the mud. The cost of excavation exceeded any potential value, so she stayed, slowly rotting into the landscape, a reminder of a vanished age that fewer people remembered with each passing year. Elias had walked past her 1,000 times, never giving her much thought. She was just there, like the pilings and the warehouses and the smell of the river. Background, wallpaper, the kind of thing your eyes slide over without really seeing, until the auction. Marcus Webb decided to clean up the riverfront one spring, which meant selling off anything he could claim ownership to that wasn't generating revenue. Old equipment, abandoned buildings, parcels of land that were too small or poorly situated to develop. and the mudlark, which technically sat on property his grandfather had acquired during one of the post-war land shuffles. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in April, the kind of day when the sky couldn't decide between sun and rain, so it delivered both in irregular intervals. A dozen men showed up, mostly out of curiosity. The auctioneer was a thin man from Memphis who looked pained to be handling such modest lots. When he got to the mudlark, he didn't even try to sell it properly. One decommissioned sternwheeler, currently resting 300 yards south of the main dock. Sold as is, where is. Buyer responsible for all removal and cleanup costs. We'll start the bidding at $5. Silence. A few men chuckled. The auctioneer sighed. Any interest at all? $2? More silence. Then, from the back, Marcus Webb's voice, "I'll give you $1 just to get it off the books." Laughter rippled through the small crowd. The auctioneer looked relieved. "We have $1. Going once. $2. Every head turned. Elias stood near the back, one hand raised slightly, his expression neutral. He'd come to the auction because he'd heard there might be some old tools or equipment going cheap, something he could resell for a small profit. The mudlark hadn't been on his radar at all. But something about Marcus's casual dismissal, the easy assumption that the old boat was worthless, had sparked something in him. Not defiance, exactly. Elias wasn't the defiant type, but a quiet stubbornness, a refusal to let Marcus have the final word on everything. Marcus stared at him, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation. "You're bidding on a pile of rotting wood?" $2, Elias repeated calmly. The auctioneer sensed potential entertainment. "We have $2. Do I hear 3? Marcus could have bid again. $2 meant nothing to him. But there was something about Elias's calm certainty that made him hesitate. If he bid again, he'd look petty, squabbling over pennies with the poorest man on the docks. If he let it go, he could turn it into a joke at Elias's expense. He chose the joke. "Sold," the auctioneer announced, "to the gentleman in the back for $2. As Elias made his way forward to settle the bill, Marcus called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "River Rat just bought himself a tomb. How long you figure before that wreck collapses on him? I'll give it a week." More laughter. Jimmy Potts, emboldened by the crowd, "I'll bet 2 weeks. That wood's been rotting for 40 years. It'll take at least that long to finally give up." The jokes continued as Elias paid his $2 every cent he had left after buying flour and coffee earlier that week and accepted the deed. The paper was water-stained and barely legible, but it was legal. The mudlark was his. Walking back to his shack that afternoon, Elias felt the weight of his fellow dockworkers' amusement like a physical thing, but beneath it ran something else, a quiet satisfaction that he now owned something. Not much, granted. A rotting hull that most people considered worthless. But it was his, bought fair and square, and nobody could take it from him. That night, lying in his narrow bed, listening to the river sounds through the thin walls, Elias made his plan. The mudlark might be rotted wood and faded paint, but somewhere in that wreckage was iron, boilerplate, fittings, maybe even some brass worth salvaging. If he worked carefully, methodically, he could strip out enough metal to sell for scrap. It wouldn't make him rich, but it might earn back his $2 and then some. He fell asleep thinking about iron and brass, about how much weight he could carry in a day, about which scrap dealers might give him a fair price. He had no idea that 40 years of sludge and decay had been protecting something far more valuable than boilerplate, that his $2 purchase would change everything, that the laughingstock of Cypress Landing was about to become its wealthiest citizen. But that discovery was still ahead. For now, Elias was just a man who'd bought a rotting steamboat because he was too stubborn to let Marcus Webb have the last word, and too poor to waste $2 on anything but the hope of salvaging something useful from the wreckage. Elias began work on the mudlark the next morning, carrying his tools in a canvas sack that had seen better decades, a claw hammer, a pry bar, a folding shovel he'd found in an alley behind the hardware store, wire cutters, a hacksaw, with a blade that still had some teeth left, the tools of a man who'd spent his life making do with whatever he could scavenge. The walk from his shack to the wreck took 10 minutes through marsh grass that soaked his pant legs to the knee. The ground near the riverbank was unstable, sucking at his boots with each step. When he finally reached the mudlark, he stood for a moment, studying what he'd bought. Up close, the decay was even more comprehensive than he'd expected. The railings had collapsed in several places, leaving gaps like missing teeth. The pilot house had caved in completely, its windows long gone, roof timbers exposed to 40 years of weather. Moss grew thick on the north-facing side, and mushrooms sprouted from cracks in the deck planking. The whole structure leaned slightly to port, as if the boat was tired and trying to lie down. But underneath all that rot and ruin, Elias could see the bones of something that had once been solid. The main support beams were oak, thick as a man's torso. The boiler housing was still intact, its iron plates showing rust, but no major breaches. The paddle wheel framework, though skeletal, remained structurally sound. He climbed aboard carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The deck groaned but held. He made his way toward the stern, where the boiler room would be. That's where the best iron would hide. Heavy plate steel that might still fetch a decent price. The door to the engine deck had rotted off its hinges years ago. Elias stepped through into dimness that smelled of stagnant water and decay. His eyes adjusted slowly. Sludge covered the floor ankle-deep, 40 years of accumulated river mud that had seeped in through cracks and gaps. The boiler itself was a massive cylinder of riveted iron, streaked with rust but still imposing. Elias spent the first hour just clearing debris, tossing rotted beams and collapsed shelving through the missing door. The work was hard, but familiar, the kind of labor his body knew how to do without thinking. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool morning air. His hands found their rhythm: lift, twist, throw. Lift, twist, throw. Around mid-morning, Jimmy Potts appeared at the gap where the door had been, arms crossed, grinning. "How's the tomb construction going, River Rat?" Elias didn't look up from his work. "Progressing. Marcus is taking bets on how long before you give up. Smart money says 3 days. Marcus can spend his money however he likes." Jimmy laughed. "You're a stubborn old fool, you know that? There's nothing in there worth the effort." "Maybe," Elias said, "but it's my effort to waste." Jimmy shook his head and left. Elias heard him laughing as he walked away, the sound fading into the general noise of the waterfront. By afternoon, Elias had cleared most of the loose debris. What remained was the sludge itself, thick and foul-smelling, covering everything below knee-height. He'd need to shovel it out, bucket by bucket, before he could properly assess what iron was worth salvaging. He started in the corner nearest the boiler, where the floor should be most solid. The shovel bit into the sludge with a wet sound, releasing odors of rot and stagnant water. He lifted, turned, dumped the muck through the open doorway. Again. The work was mind-numbing, but Elias didn't mind. He'd done worse for less money. 3 hours into the shoveling, his blade hit something that didn't feel like mud or rotted wood. Something solid, metallic. He cleared the sludge away more carefully, using his hands when the shovel proved too crude. What emerged was a section of floor plate, iron instead of the wooden planking he'd expected. That was odd. Engine room floors were typically wood, easier to replace, less expensive, lighter weight. He traced the edges of the plate with his fingers, feeling for seams. It was roughly 4 feet square, set flush with the surrounding wooden floor, no visible bolts or rivets. He cleared more sludge, widening his search, and found the edges all around. Elias sat back on his heels, frowning. An iron plate this size, hidden under the engine room floor, didn't make sense, unless someone had reinforced this section for some reason. Maybe the original planking had rotted out and been replaced. He wedged his pry bar into the seam and levered upward. Nothing. He repositioned, tried again. Still nothing. The plate was either rusted shut or secured from below. He spent the next hour working the pry bar around all 4 edges, trying to find a weak point. His shoulders burned from the effort, Sweat dripped into his eyes, but gradually he felt something give. A tiny shift, barely perceptible. He worked the bar deeper into the gap, using it like a lever, putting his full weight into it. The plate resisted, then suddenly lifted with a grinding shriek of rust on rust. The smell hit him first. Not the expected odor of more river mud, but something drier, mustier. The smell of enclosed space and old air. Elias pulled the plate fully aside, setting it against the boiler housing, and looked down into darkness. A hole, maybe 6 feet deep, lined with iron on all sides. Not a design flaw, not a repair. A deliberate construction, a hiding place. His heart hammered against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He grabbed a piece of broken timber, wrapped it with an oily rag from his pocket, and lit it with a match. The makeshift torch flared, casting wavering light into the hidden compartment. Crates, wooden crates, stacked neat as military supplies, 20 of them, maybe more, in the shadows. Each about 2 feet long, a foot wide, sealed with what looked like tar or pitch, and next to them, canvas sacks with drawstrings, bulging with something heavy. Elias lowered himself into the compartment, torch held high. The crates bore no markings that he could see, no labels or stamps, but they'd been placed here deliberately, protected from the river by iron walls, sealed against moisture, hidden beneath a floor plate that looked identical to the surrounding decking. He set the torch in a crack between crates and examined the nearest canvas sack. The fabric was old, but surprisingly intact, protected by the dry environment. He loosened the drawstring and reached inside. His fingers touched metal. Cold, heavy, smooth. He pulled out a bar roughly the size of a brick. Gold. Even in the flickering torchlight, there was no mistaking it. The weight, the color, the way it seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. Elias stood very still, the gold bar in his hands, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't scrap iron. This wasn't salvage. This was a fortune. He set the bar carefully on top of a crate and examined the nearest one. The tar seal cracked when he pried at it with his knife, brittle after decades of aging. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were bundles of papers. He unfolded one carefully. Confederate Treasury bonds, printed on expensive paper, signed and sealed, promising the bearer payment in gold or silver. Worthless now, of course. The Confederate government had dissolved 60 years ago, its promises void. But the gold was real. The gold was current. Elias climbed out of the compartment slowly, his legs shaking. He sat on the edge of the iron-lined hole, staring down at the crates and sacks, trying to process what he'd found. Someone had hidden this here. During the war, probably, a Confederate officer or Treasury official, fleeing with what could be saved before the final collapse. The Mudlark would have been perfect, a working packet boat, unremarkable, able to move freely on the river before the Union blockades tightened completely. But then the boat had run aground in the flood, and whoever had hidden this fortune either died before they could return, or couldn't risk coming back once the war ended and Union authorities occupied the river towns. For 40 years this wealth had sat here, hidden, forgotten, protected by nothing more than mud and the assumption that a rotting wreck held nothing of value. Elias looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear or excitement, but from the sudden weight of possibility. With this gold, he could buy a real house, eat regularly, never worry about where the next dollar would come from. He could live like the men who'd mocked him for 63 years. He could buy Marcus Webb's entire shipping company if he wanted. The thought made him laugh. A single bark of sound that echoed strangely in the empty engine room. The laughingstock of Cypress Landing, sitting on top of a Confederate fortune. He looked at the gold bar still resting on the crate. Then he carefully replaced it in the canvas sack, cinched the drawstring tight, and climbed out of the compartment. He positioned the iron plate back in place, then shoveled sludge over it until the seam disappeared completely. Nobody needed to know. Not yet. Not until he'd figured out what to do. That night, Lying in his narrow bed, Elias didn't sleep at all. His mind raced with possibilities and problems in equal measure. The gold was his. Legally, he'd bought the boat and everything in it, but claiming it openly would raise questions. Where had it come from? Why had it been hidden? Would the government try to seize it as Confederate property? He needed to be careful, smart, patient. The irony didn't escape him. He'd spent his entire life being careful, smart, and patient just to survive. Now he'd need those same skills to figure out how to be rich. For 3 days, Elias continued his salvage work on the Mudlark as if nothing had changed. He showed up each morning with his canvas tool sack, cleared debris, shoveled sludge, and made a show of examining boiler plates and iron fittings. When Jimmy Potts or other dock workers stopped by to mock his progress, he responded with the same patient indifference he'd always shown. But everything had changed. At night, he lay awake making plans, discarding them, making new ones. The simplest approach would be to take the gold to a bank in Memphis or New Orleans, exchange it quietly, and live off the proceeds. But banks kept records. They asked questions. A man like Elias, showing up with Confederate gold bars, would attract exactly the kind of attention he couldn't afford. He could sell it piecemeal to different buyers, small amounts at a time, spreading the transactions over months or years. Safer, but slow, and it required trusting dealers who might rob him or report him to authorities. Or he could use it strategically, not to buy comfort, but to buy power. The kind of power that made questions disappear before they were asked. That thought kept circling back, persistent as river current. On the 4th morning, Elias made a decision. He would take 1 bar, just one, test the waters, see what was possible. He waited until afternoon when the docks were busy with a cargo shipment, everyone's attention focused on the work. Then he slipped into the Mudlark, uncovered the hidden compartment, and selected a single gold bar from one of the canvas sacks. He wrapped it in an old shirt, tucked it into his tool bag, and covered it with his shovel and pry bar. The walk back to his shack felt longer than usual. Every face he passed seemed suspicious, every glance a potential threat, but nobody paid him any attention. He was just River Rat, same as always, invisible in his familiarity. In his shack, he unwrapped the bar and set it on the small table that served as his desk, dining surface, and workspace. In the dim light filtering through his single grimy window, the gold seemed almost alive, holding a warmth that the cold iron and wood around it lacked. He'd seen gold before, of course. Wedding rings, watch chains, the occasional coin in the collection plate at the church he'd attended with his mother. But never anything like this. This was wealth in its purest form, condensed and undeniable. The next decision was where to take it. Memphis had larger banks, more anonymity, but it also meant a day's travel each way, and someone might notice his absence. Cypress Landing had one bank, the First River Trust, run by a man named Harrison Ames, who'd been friendly with Marcus Webb for 30 years. There was another option, though. Virgil Deacon ran a jewelry and watch repair shop 2 streets back from the waterfront. He bought gold and silver for his repair work, melted down old pieces, traded in precious metals as a side business. He was known to be discreet, which in a river town meant he asked fewer questions than he probably should. Elias wrapped the bar back in the shirt, put it in a burlap sack with some potatoes he'd bought the day before, and walked to Deacon's shop just before closing time. The shop was narrow, wedged between a cobbler and a tobacco merchant. A bell chimed when Elias pushed open the door. Inside smelled of metal polish and oil. Glass cases displayed watches, rings, brooches, all arranged with careful precision. Virgil Deacon looked up from his workbench. He was a thin man in his 50s, wearing spectacles that magnified his eyes into something owlish. "Help you with something?" "Need to sell some gold," Elias said simply. Deacon's expression didn't change, but something sharpened in his gaze. "What kind of gold?" Elias set the burlap sack on the counter, pushed aside the potatoes, and unwrapped the bar. For a long moment, Deacon just stared. Then he stood, came around the counter, and examined the bar under his jeweler's loupe. He tested the weight, scratched it lightly with a tool Elias didn't recognize, held it up to the light. "Where'd you get this?" His voice was carefully neutral. "Does it matter?" "It might. Depends on whether you stole it." "Bought it legal," Elias said, which was true in a sense. He'd bought the boat. Everything in the boat came with the purchase. Deacon studied him for another long moment. Then he set the bar on a scale, recorded the weight, and did some calculations on a piece of paper. "I can give you $300, cash, today." Elias felt his breath catch. $300, more money than he'd earned in the last 5 years combined, enough to live comfortably for a year, maybe longer if he was careful. But he knew gold, knew what it traded for. This bar was worth at least $400, probably closer to $500 at current market rates. Deacon was offering him 60% of value, counting on Elias being desperate or ignorant or both. $450, Elias said calmly. Deacon's eyebrows rose. "You know the market?" "I know when I'm being shorted." A pause. Then Deacon smiled slightly, an expression that held something like respect. $400. Final offer. "And I never saw you, never saw this bar, never had this conversation." Elias considered. 400 was fair, considering Deacon's discretion and his risk. "Agreed." Deacon went to his safe, counted out the money carefully. $20 bills, all of them. He wrapped them in brown paper, tied the bundle with string, and handed it across the counter. "You come across more," he said quietly. "I can handle larger transactions, but not here, and not all at once." Elias nodded, pocketed the money, and left. Walking back to his shack, he felt the weight of the bills against his chest like a heartbeat. $400, a fortune to him, pocket change compared to what still sat hidden in the mudlark. That night, he made his first real purchase in years. He went to the general store and bought a proper lock for his door, heavy iron, with a key that felt substantial in his hand. Then he bought real coffee, not the chicory mix substitute he usually drank. A pound of bacon, fresh eggs, a loaf of bread that had been baked that morning. The store owner, Mrs. Chen, looked at him with surprise. "You having a celebration, Elias?" "Just felt like eating well for once," he said. She wrapped his purchases without comment, but he saw her exchange a glance with her husband. The kind of glance that said something had changed, something was different, even if they couldn't quite place what. Word would spread. River Rat was spending money. Not much, just enough to be noticed. And in a town like Cypress Landing, any deviation from routine created ripples. Elias took his purchases home, installed the new lock, and cooked himself a breakfast for dinner that made his small shack smell like places he'd only walked past before, warm, abundant, secure. As he ate, he thought about his next moves. The gold gave him options he'd never had, but options came with risks. Every dollar he spent was a signal, a change in the pattern that people might notice. And people who noticed might ask questions. Marcus Webb especially would notice. Marcus paid attention to the docks and everyone on them with the focus of a man who believed knowledge was control. If River Rat suddenly had money, Marcus would want to know why. Elias needed a story, something plausible, something that would explain a modest improvement in his circumstances without revealing the truth. He thought about it while he washed his dishes, an act that felt almost luxurious with the knowledge that there was more food in the cupboard, that tomorrow's meal wasn't uncertain. The answer came to him as he dried the last plate. Salvage. He'd tell anyone who asked that he'd found some valuable brass fittings in the mudlark, sold them for scrap, made a small profit. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious. Just enough to explain buying better food and fixing up his shack a bit. It was a good lie because it was mostly true. He was salvaging the mudlark. He had found valuable metal. The only difference was what kind of metal and how much. As he settled into bed that night on sheets he'd bought along with the food, actual cotton sheets instead of the flour sacks he'd been using, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not quite hope, more like possibility. The sense that tomorrow might be different from today, and that the difference might be good. Outside, the river flowed past in darkness, carrying its secrets and its commerce toward the Gulf. The mudlark sat in her mudbank, protecting her hidden cargo for another night. And in his tar-paper shack, River Rat Cole slept the deep sleep of a man who'd survived 63 years of scarcity, and now, for the first time, had the means to do more than just survive. The question was what he'd do with those means, and whether he could navigate the complex waters of sudden wealth without drowning. Marcus Webb noticed within a week. Elias was repairing the roof of his shack when Marcus's shadow fell across the worksite. He looked down to find the shipping company owner standing in the muddy lane, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Heard you had some luck with that wreck," Marcus said. Elias hammered in another nail before responding. "Found some brass fittings, sold them." "Brass fittings bought you new roofing tar? New boots?" Marcus gestured toward Elias's feet, where indeed a pair of sturdy work boots had replaced the newspaper-stuffed wrecks he'd worn for the past 3 years. "Sold enough brass to live a little better," Elias said evenly. "That a problem?" Marcus studied him with the intensity of a man who'd built his life on reading people. "Just interesting, is all. You spend 60 years scraping by on nothing, then suddenly you're buying new boots and real coffee. Makes a man curious about what else might be hidden in that old boat." "Nothing but rust and rot," Elias said. "The brass was luck. Rest is just hard work." "Luck," Marcus repeated, his tone suggesting he didn't believe in such things. "Well, enjoy it while it lasts. Luck has a way of running out on men like you." He walked away, but Elias felt the weight of that conversation long after Marcus disappeared. The shipping company owner's curiosity was dangerous. Men like Marcus didn't ask questions out of friendly interest. They asked because they were calculating angles, looking for leverage, figuring out how to turn someone else's fortune into their own. Elias needed to be more careful. The improvements to his life had to stay modest, spread out over time. No dramatic changes, nothing that would make Marcus dig deeper. But it was hard to go back to poverty when you knew you didn't have to. That afternoon, Sarah Brennan stopped by with her coffee cart. She'd been rolling it past his shack for 20 years, rarely stopping because Elias rarely had money for coffee. Today she lingered, studying the new tar on his roof. "Heard you got lucky with some salvage," she said, pouring him a cup without asking. "On the house. Figure you can afford to pay it forward next time." Elias accepted the cup, grateful. Sarah had always been kind in small ways, the kind that didn't cost her much, but meant everything to someone who had nothing. Appreciate it. "Marcus was asking about you at the diner this morning," she said casually, but her eyes were serious. "Wanted to know if you'd been spending unusual amounts, if anyone had seen you with money." "What'd you tell him?" "That you bought some decent food and fixed your roof. Nothing criminal about that." She paused. "He doesn't like things he can't control, Elias. You be careful." After she left, Elias sat on his front step, sipping the coffee, real coffee, rich and dark, and thinking about what careful meant now. Before the gold, careful meant keeping your head down, staying invisible, never drawing attention. Now, careful meant something more complex. It meant managing perception, controlling information, staying one step ahead of people who had resources he couldn't match, unless he matched them. The thought hit him like cold water. Why was he still thinking like a poor man? He had enough gold in that compartment to buy Marcus's entire operation 10 times over. The problem wasn't resources, it was mindset. He'd spent 63 years learning to be small, to take up as little space as possible, to survive on the margins. That instinct ran deep, programmed by decades of necessity. But those rules didn't apply anymore. He just needed to learn new ones. Over the next few days, Elias experimented with small acts of generosity. He paid Jimmy Potts to help clear debris from the mudlark, giving the man a fair wage for a day's work. He bought bread and cheese from Mrs. chen and left it on old Silas's piling, anonymously. He paid a month's rent in advance on his shack to the landlord who'd been letting him slide for years on deferred payments. These weren't dramatic gestures, but they changed something in the social fabric of the docks. People started seeing him differently, not as River Rat, the joke who lived on scraps, but as Elias Cole, a man who'd had some luck and was sharing it around. The shift was subtle but real. Men nodded to him who'd looked through him before. Sarah started stopping by regularly with coffee. Even Jimmy, usually quick with a cutting remark, treated him with something approaching respect. But not everyone welcomed the change. Marcus Webb called him to the shipping company office on a Thursday morning. The summons came through one of the dock foremen, delivered with a tone that suggested refusal wasn't an option. Elias climbed the stairs to the office overlooking the waterfront, aware that this conversation would determine much about his immediate future. Marcus sat behind a large oak desk, the kind of furniture that announced importance. Behind him, windows overlooked the docks, giving him a view of everything that happened in his domain. "Sit," Marcus said, not looking up from papers he was signing. Elias sat in the simple wooden chair across the desk, the kind you'd give to someone you wanted uncomfortable. Marcus finished his paperwork, set down his pen, and finally looked up. "I've been thinking about your salvage operation. Have you? That wreck sits on property I own, which means anything you pull out of it technically belongs to me." Elias felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice level. "I bought the boat at legal auction. Bill of sale says everything on and in the vessel comes with the purchase. Bills of sale can be challenged, especially when the buyer didn't have full information about what he was purchasing." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "How much brass did you really find, Elias?" "Enough to fix my roof, and buy new boots, and start paying people for work, and suddenly have cash for food that isn't day-old bread." Marcus's eyes were hard. "Something in that wreck is worth more than scrap brass, and I want to know what it is." This was the moment. Elias could feel it. How he responded would shape everything that followed. If he showed weakness, Marcus would press harder. If he showed too much strength, Marcus would become an enemy instead of just a problem. "You're right," Elias said quietly. "I found more than brass." Marcus leaned forward, interest sharp in his eyes. "What?" "I found pride." Elias held Marcus's gaze. 60 years I've lived on these docks, invisible, doing the jobs nobody wanted, taking the scraps nobody needed. You paid me half what you paid other men for the same work, and I took it because I had no choice. But I bought that boat legal, found legal salvage inside, and for the first time in my life, I don't have to bow and scrape for every penny. Pride doesn't pay for new boots, Marcus said. The brass did, and some iron fittings, and careful living. Elias stood slowly. I know you're used to controlling everything on these docks, every dollar, every opportunity. But that boat is mine. What I find in it is mine. And unless you want to challenge a legal sale in court, which would cost you more in legal fees than whatever you think I found, I'd suggest you let this go. The silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands flat on the desk. Elias could see him calculating, weighing options, deciding whether this particular battle was worth fighting. Finally Marcus spoke, his voice cold. Get out of my office. Elias left, walking down the stairs with steady steps, even though his heart hammered. He'd just made an enemy of the most powerful man on the waterfront. But he'd also drawn a line that said he wouldn't be pushed around anymore. The question now was whether Marcus would respect that line or try to cross it. That night, Elias sat in his shack, with the door locked and the new lantern he'd bought casting steady light. He counted the money he had left from the first gold bar, still over $300, carefully hidden in a tin box under his floorboards. The confrontation with Marcus had clarified something. Hiding the gold forever wasn't an option. Eventually someone would figure it out, or he'd make a mistake, or circumstances would force his hand. He needed a plan that didn't rely on secrecy alone. He needed to become untouchable, Not through hiding, but through power. And that meant taking risks he'd spent his whole life avoiding. Elias returned to Virgil Deacon's shop a week later, this time with 2 gold bars wrapped in a flour sack. He timed his arrival for late afternoon, when the street would be less busy, when shadows gave him cover he wouldn't have in full daylight. The bell chimed. Deacon looked up from his workbench, saw Elias, and immediately put down his tools. He walked to the door, turned the open sign to closed, and pulled down the shade. 2 more? He asked quietly. Elias set the sack on the counter and unwrapped the bars. Deacon examined them with the same careful attention he'd shown the first one. Then he did his calculations, went to the safe, and counted out $800 in mixed bills. "This is getting to be substantial money," he said. "You understand what that means? Means I can buy things I need. Means people will notice. Means questions." Deacon pushed the money across the counter. "I can handle more transactions, but not like this. You walk in here every week with gold bars. Eventually someone's going to wonder where River Rat Cole is getting Confederate bullion. What do you suggest?" Deacon thought for a moment. "You need a story. A legitimate front, something that explains income without raising eyebrows." He paused. "You know anything about real estate?" Elias frowned. "Never owned anything worth calling property." "Exactly. Which means nobody would question if you started small. Buy a parcel of cheap land, sit on it, sell it for a modest profit, do it again. Each transaction is legal, documented, creates a paper trail of legitimate business. Meanwhile, you come see me every month or so, sell me some gold, and deposit the proceeds as profits from your real estate ventures." It was clever. Elias could see the logic. "Where do I start?" "County land auction, next Tuesday. They're selling off tax-delinquent properties. You could pick up parcels for almost nothing, hold them a few months, sell to developers or farmers looking to expand." Deacon pulled out a newspaper, folded to the legal notices. "This parcel here, 30 acres outside town. Back taxes owed are $60. It'll probably sell for 70, maybe 80 at auction. You hold it 6 months, sell it for 120. Small profit. But it establishes you as someone who dabbles in land deals." Elias studied the listing. 30 acres of riverside property deemed undesirable due to seasonal flooding, which meant nobody wanted it, which meant he could probably get it cheap. "You think this would work?" "I think it gives you cover for having money, and in a year or 2, if you play it right, you could be known as a shrewd land investor instead of a lucky salvage operator. Much safer position." Elias left the shop with $800 and a newspaper folded to the real estate section. Walking back through the evening streets, he felt the weight of transformation. 2 months ago, he'd been invisible. Now he was creating a new identity, building a facade of legitimacy around wealth that had fallen into his lap by pure chance. The irony struck him as he passed the old church where he'd attended services with his mother. She'd believed in providence, in things happening for reasons beyond human understanding. If she could see him now, walking around with $1,000 in his pocket and plans to buy land, would she think it was providence? Or would she warn him that easy wealth came with hard consequences? He stopped at the church steps, looking up at the modest steeple. He hadn't been inside in 40 years, not since her funeral. Religion had felt like another luxury he couldn't afford, another promise that never delivered. But standing there now, he wondered if maybe she'd been right about some things, that life had patterns, that struggle had purpose, that everything, even suffering, led somewhere. Elias Cole, as I live and breathe. He turned to find Father Sullivan standing in the doorway, older than Elias remembered, white-haired and stooped, but still wearing the same gentle expression he'd had when Elias's mother was alive. "Father," Elias nodded. "Haven't seen you in these parts for a long time." The priest came down the steps slowly, using a cane for balance. "Heard you had some luck with that old steamboat." "Some," Elias admitted. "Good. Your mother would be pleased to know you're doing better." Father Sullivan smiled. "She worried about you those last years." Worried you'd spend your whole life struggling, never catching a break. The words hit harder than Elias expected. She said that? Many times. She had faith, though. Believed things would turn around for you eventually. The priest studied him with eyes that had seen 6 decades of human nature. She'd want you to use whatever fortune comes your way wisely, not just for yourself. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. I'm not a charity case anymore, Father. Don't need to be told how to spend my money. Didn't say you were, or that you did. Father Sullivan's voice remained gentle. Just reminding you of what your mother believed, that we're all part of something larger than ourselves, that good fortune carries responsibility. After the priest went back inside, Elias stood on the steps a while longer, thinking about responsibility and providence and the various ways a man could lose himself, even when he found wealth. The land auction was held in the courthouse on Tuesday. Elias arrived early, wearing the best clothes he owned, still shabby by most standards, but clean and mended. About 20 people filled the auction room, mostly farmers and businessmen looking for cheap parcels they could develop or farm. Marcus Webb was there, sitting in the front row. Elias felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. He took a seat in the back, the folded newspaper in his pocket marking the properties he'd researched. The auctioneer worked through the lots quickly. Small parcels went for pittances, larger ones drew competitive bidding. When they reached the 30-acre riverside property, the auctioneer's voice carried a note of apology. 30 acres, riverside access, prone to seasonal flooding. Minimum bid of $70 to cover back taxes and fees. $70, someone called from the middle of the room. 80, Elias said clearly. Heads turned. Marcus Webb's head turned. A pause. Then the original bidder, 90. 100, Elias countered. The room went quiet. $100 for flood-prone property was ambitious. The other bidder shook his head and sat down. Going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $100. Elias paid in cash at the clerk's window, accepted the deed, and left quickly. But not before Marcus caught up with him on the courthouse steps. Buying land now? Marcus's tone was light, but his eyes were calculating. That's quite a step up from salvaging brass. Seemed like a good investment, Elias said. Flood-prone riverside property? Most people would call that throwing money away. Most people aren't looking at the same angles I am. Elias met his gaze steadily. Land is land. Even if it floods, it's still there when the water recedes. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You've changed, River Rat. Got some backbone all of a sudden. Makes me wonder what else changed besides your finances. Maybe I just got tired of being invisible. Visible means people pay attention. Pay attention means they ask questions. Marcus stepped closer, voice dropping. Whatever you found in that wreck, it's going to come out eventually. Secrets always do. And when it does, I'll be there to take my share. There's nothing to share, Elias said, just salvage and smart investing. Marcus smiled, cold and predatory. We'll see. That night, Elias spread the land deed on his table and studied it by lamplight. 30 acres of riverside property, legally his. It wasn't much compared to what men like Marcus owned, but it was more than he'd ever imagined having. More importantly, it was cover, a legitimate reason for having money to invest, a foundation on which he could build a new identity not as River Rat Cole, the dock scavenger, but as Elias Cole, land investor and businessman. The transformation would take time, patience, the same qualities that had kept him alive for 63 years. But now, those qualities would serve a different purpose. Not just survival, but elevation. Not just getting by, but getting ahead. He folded the deed carefully and locked it in the tin box with his remaining cash. Outside, the river flowed past in darkness, indifferent to the small dramas playing out along its banks. The mudlark sat in her mudbank, still hiding her secrets, still protecting the fortune that was slowly transforming a man who'd spent his whole life being overlooked. The question wasn't whether he could keep the secret, it was whether he could become powerful enough that the secret wouldn't matter anymore. Over the next 3 months, Elias bought and sold 4 more parcels of land. Nothing dramatic, small transactions that established him as someone who understood property values and wasn't afraid to take calculated risks. The profits were modest but documented, creating exactly the paper trail Virgil Deacon had suggested. Meanwhile, he continued selling gold bars at careful intervals, spacing the transactions far enough apart to avoid suspicion. By autumn, he had nearly $3,000 in various accounts and hiding places, with most of the gold still untouched in the Mudlark's hidden compartment. The change in his circumstances brought unexpected complications. Sarah Brennan started stopping by his shack more frequently, bringing coffee and conversation. At first, Elias thought she was just being friendly, the way she'd always been, in small ways. But gradually he realized there was something else in her visits, a tentative hope, a careful testing of possibilities. One evening, she lingered after bringing him dinner from her cart, watching while he ate the stew she'd made. "You ever think about settling down?" she asked casually. "Having something more than just work and sleep?" Elias looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time. She was close to his age, weathered by the same hard years that had marked him. But there was a warmth in her eyes, a kindness that had survived decades of river town hardship. "Never seemed practical," he said honestly. "Hard to settle when you're barely surviving. And now that you're not barely surviving..." The question hung between them. Elias understood what she was asking, what she was offering: companionship, partnership. The kind of human connection he'd done without for so long he'd almost forgotten it was possible. "Sarah," he said gently, "you're a good woman. Kind, but I'm not the man you think I am. You're a man who got lucky and is trying to do right with it. That's more than most can claim. It's more complicated than that." He wanted to tell her about the gold, about the web of half-truths he was building, about the constant fear of discovery. But those were burdens he couldn't share. "I've got things I'm dealing with. Things that wouldn't be fair to bring into someone else's life." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, the offer stands. If you ever decide you want more than just money in your life, you know where to find me." After she left, Elias sat in the deepening darkness, thinking about roads not taken and the various ways wealth could isolate a man, even as it opened doors. He'd spent 60 years alone because he had no choice. Now he was choosing it because the alternative, bringing someone into the complicated mess his life had become, seemed cruel. But the loneliness felt different now, sharper, like something lost instead of something never had. The next morning brought a different kind of complication. Jimmy Potts showed up at the Mudlark while Elias was doing his regular maintenance, keeping up the appearance of salvage work, even though he'd long since removed everything of conventional value. "Got a proposition for you," Jimmy said, settling onto a beam with the ease of long familiarity. "This land dealing you're doing. Think you could teach me?" Elias looked up from the iron fitting he'd been pretending to examine. "Why?" "Because I'm 54 years old, and my hands don't work like they used to." Jimmy held up his damaged hand, the missing fingers a permanent reminder of the dock's dangers. "Can't do heavy labor much longer. Figure if I'm going to survive the next 20 years, I need to learn how to make money with my head instead of my back." It was the most honest Jimmy had ever been with him. Elias set down the fitting, considering Jimmy wasn't a bad man, just a hard one, shaped by the same scarcity that had shaped them all. Teaching him about land dealing wouldn't cost Elias anything, and it might actually help someone who needed it. "It's not complicated," Elias said. "You find property nobody wants, buy it cheap, hold it until someone needs it, sell for a modest profit. The trick is knowing what land will matter eventually." "How do you know that?" "You pay attention. Where's the town growing? What businesses are expanding? Where are the railroads planning to run new lines?" Elias gestured toward the river. "This property I bought, the flood-prone 30 acres, I'm betting the town will eventually need it for a new dock facility. They'll have to solve the flooding problem, but once they do, that land becomes valuable. Jimmy nodded slowly, absorbing this. You'd help me? Even after all the times I gave you grief? You weren't wrong to give me grief. I was river rat, living on scraps. Nothing wrong with calling what you see. Elias paused. But things change. People change. No reason we can't both benefit from that. Over the following weeks, Elias taught Jimmy what he'd learned about land investment. They'd meet at Sarah's coffee cart, spreading county maps and auction notices across the rough wooden boards, talking about parcels and prices and timing. Jimmy was a quick study, his mind sharp despite years of physical labor. Other dockworkers started to notice, not just the meetings, but the change in how Jimmy and Elias interacted. The old mockery faded, replaced by something more like respect. And as word spread that Elias was willing to share his knowledge, others started approaching him with questions. It was old Silas who named what was happening, sitting on his piling one afternoon while Elias walked past. "You're becoming someone," the old man said, his voice rough as driftwood. Elias stopped. "Just trying to get by." "No. Getting by is what you did before. This is different." Silas gestured at the docks, the river, the whole struggling town. "You're becoming someone who matters, who changes things. Dangerous how? Because mattering means people depend on you, and people who depend on you expect things, and when you can't deliver what they expect, they turn." Silas fixed him with eyes that had seen too much. "Marcus Webb matters. Look at how he lives, always watching his back, always worried about challenges to his power. You sure you want that life?" The question stayed with Elias long after he walked away. Did he want to matter, or did he just want to be comfortable? There was a difference, and he was beginning to understand that the gold forced a choice. He couldn't just use it to make himself comfortable and stay invisible. The money demanded visibility. Investment demanded interaction. Change demanded conflict. That night, Elias made his fourth trip to Virgil Deacon's shop, this time with 3 gold bars. The transaction was smooth, practiced. Deacon counted out $1,200 without comment. But as Elias turned to leave, the jeweler spoke. "You know, Marcus Webb came to see me last week." Elias stopped. What did he want? Asked if I'd been buying gold. Asked if I knew where it might be coming from. Deacon's expression was neutral. "I told him I deal in estate jewelry and scrap, nothing unusual. But he's fishing, Elias. And he's not stupid. What do you think he knows?" "I think he knows you have money from somewhere. I think he knows it's more than land dealing should generate this quickly. And I think he's trying to figure out how to get a piece of it." Deacon paused. "You might want to consider making him an ally instead of an enemy. By giving him gold, that's legally mine. By giving him a stake in something that keeps him from destroying you to get everything." Deacon's voice was quiet but firm. "Pride is expensive, Elias. Sometimes the smart play is to share profits with someone who could otherwise take them all." Walking home, Elias thought about alliance and compromise and the various ways a man could lose what he'd found. Marcus Webb represented power built on decades of accumulation and connection. Elias represented sudden wealth with no infrastructure to protect it. In a straight fight, Marcus would win. He had lawyers, connections, the kind of social capital that could destroy a man's reputation before he even knew he was under attack. But Elias had something Marcus didn't: the source. As long as the gold remained hidden, as long as he controlled access to the mudlark, he held the ultimate leverage. The question was whether to use that leverage for defense or offense. That night, he sat at his table with maps and auction notices and bank statements, plotting his next moves. The naive plan of hiding forever was dead. The practical plan of gradual wealth building was too slow and too vulnerable to Marcus's interference. He needed a third option, something bold enough to establish him as untouchable, but not so reckless that it exposed the source of his wealth. He needed to stop thinking like someone who'd always been poor, and start thinking like someone who could afford to take real risks? The answer came to him near midnight, so simple and audacious he almost laughed. He'd buy the shipping company. Not aggressively, not obviously, but piece by piece, investment by investment, until he owned enough to matter, until Marcus had to treat him as an equal, not a threat to be crushed. It would take most of the gold. It would take time. It would take nerves he wasn't sure he had. But it would work, and when it was done, River Rat Cole would own the empire that had once employed him for scraps. Elias's plan to acquire the shipping company started with research. He spent 3 weeks in the county records office, tracing ownership structures, identifying debts, mapping Marcus Webb's financial empire. What he found surprised him. The Cyprus Landing Shipping Company looked prosperous from the outside, but the books told a different story. Marcus had extended himself badly, borrowing against future revenues to expand operations that weren't generating the returns he'd promised investors. The company was leveraged to the point of fragility, held together by Marcus's reputation and the assumption that river commerce would eventually recover. But river commerce was dying. The railroads had won. Everyone knew it except men like Marcus, who couldn't imagine a world where rivers didn't matter. Elias could see the vulnerability. A few strategic investments, buying up debt, purchasing competitor operations, acquiring property Marcus needed, could give him leverage without directly confronting Marcus's authority. He started small, a warehouse lease that was coming up for renewal. Marcus needed that warehouse for cotton storage, but the owner was elderly and tired of negotiating. Elias offered to buy the property outright for a fair price. The owner accepted. When the lease renewal came up, Elias offered Marcus the same terms the previous owner had given him. Nothing aggressive. Nothing hostile. Just a business transaction. Marcus paid, but Elias saw the recognition in his eyes. The game had changed. Over the next month, Elias acquired 2 more properties Marcus depended on, bought shares in a competing freight company, and extended a loan to a supplier who'd been threatening to cut off Marcus's credit. Each move was legal, documented, and individually insignificant, but together they represented a pattern. Someone was building a position around Marcus's empire, and that someone was the man Marcus had once called River Rat. The confrontation came on a grey November morning. Elias was at his shack when Marcus's carriage pulled up, unusual enough that neighbors stopped what they were doing to watch. Marcus climbed out, walked directly to Elias's door, and knocked hard enough to rattle the frame. Elias opened it. "We need to talk," Marcus said, "not a request." "Come in." Marcus stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the modest interior with barely concealed disdain. But he didn't comment on the poverty. Instead, he pulled out a folder and dropped it on the table. "You've been busy," he said. 3 properties I need, shares in River Freight Consolidated, a loan to Canton Supplies that gives you effective veto power over their business with me." He leaned forward. "What's your game?" "No game, just investments. Don't play stupid with me." Marcus's voice was tight with controlled anger. "You're maneuvering around my business like someone with a strategy. Where is this money coming from?" This was the moment Elias had been both dreading and anticipating, the moment when the facade either held or collapsed. He met Marcus's eyes steadily. "I found more than brass in the mudlark." Marcus went very still. "How much more?" "Enough to make me a player instead of a pawn. Confederate gold." It wasn't a question. Marcus sat down slowly, his anger shifting into something more calculating. "You found Confederate Treasury gold. I found assets. What they were originally doesn't matter. What matters is what I can do with them now." Marcus was quiet for a long time, his mind visibly working through implications. Then he laughed, a sound without humor. "You magnificent bastard. You bought a wreck for $2 and found enough gold to buy my company out from under me. I'm not trying to buy your company. I'm trying to be your partner." The word hung between them. Marcus frowned. "Partner? Your shipping operation is failing," Elias said bluntly. Not because you're incompetent, but because the market is changing and you're too invested in the old ways to adapt. I have capital. You have infrastructure and expertise. Together, we could actually make something that survives what's coming. Why would I partner with you when I could just expose your gold and claim it was hidden on my property? Because it wasn't hidden on your property. It was hidden in a vessel I purchased legally. Any court would uphold my ownership. Elias paused. But more than that, because you're too smart to start a legal fight that would tie up everything for years while your company bleeds money you don't have. Marcus stared at him, and Elias could see the gears turning, pride warring with pragmatism. The desire to crush this upstart, fighting against the recognition that crushing him might destroy them both. What are you proposing? Elias pulled out papers he'd had prepared by a lawyer in Memphis, someone with no connection to Cyprus Landing. A partnership. I invest capital to modernize operations, expand into rail freight coordination, shore up your debt position. In return, I get 40% ownership and a seat on the decision-making board. 40%? You want nearly half my company? I want 40% of a company that survives the next decade. Right now, you own 100% of a company that might not make it another 3 years. Elias pushed the papers across the table. Think about it. Talk to your accountant. Look at your numbers honestly. Then decide whether pride or survival matters more. Marcus took the papers, but didn't look at them. Instead, he studied Elias with an expression that mixed resentment and grudging respect. You really did change, didn't you? River Rat the survivor became Elias Cole the shark. I became someone who refuses to be invisible anymore. You know what happens to people who rise too fast. They make enemies, powerful enemies who know how to tear down what took you months to build. Let them try, Elias said quietly. I've survived worse than powerful enemies. I've survived being nobody. After Marcus left, Elias sat at his table, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. He'd just gambled everything on Marcus's pragmatism, winning over his pride. If Marcus chose to fight instead of negotiate, the next months would be brutal. But Elias had meant what he said. He'd survived worse than this, and he had resources Marcus couldn't match. 3 days later, Marcus sent word requesting a meeting. Not at his office, but at a neutral location, the River House restaurant, where businessmen closed deals over whiskey and cigars. Elias arrived first, wearing a new suit he'd bought in Memphis. Nothing flashy, but well-made and properly fitted. The kind of suit that said he belonged in rooms where deals were made. Marcus arrived 15 minutes later with 2 other men, his lawyer and his accountant. They sat, ordered drinks, and got straight to business. I had my people review your proposal, Marcus said, and my own financial situation. You're right about the market changes, right about my leverage problems, right that I need capital I don't currently have. He paused. But 40% is too much. I'll give you 30% for a $200,000 investment. Elias shook his head. 40% for $150,000. You need my money less than you need my restraint. Those properties I bought, that freight company stock, the supplier loan, all of that goes away as part of the partnership deal. I bring those assets into the company as additional investment, and I want real authority, not just a token seat. The negotiation lasted 2 hours. They argued over percentages, control mechanisms, decision-making authority, and profit distribution. Elias held firm on the points that mattered, gave ground on details that didn't. Finally, as evening shadows lengthened across the river, they reached agreement. 40% ownership, proportional control. Elias would serve as vice president of operations, with authority over modernization and expansion efforts. They shook hands across the table, and Elias felt the shift happen in real time. He was no longer River Rat Cole, the dock scavenger. He was Elias Cole, part owner of the Cyprus Landing Shipping Company. That night, walking back to his shack, which he realized he'd need to leave soon for something more appropriate to his new position, Elias thought about transformation. How quickly a man could change from invisible to visible, from powerless to powerful, from forgotten to formidable. But he also thought about Father Sullivan's words, about responsibility, about being part of something larger than himself. The gold had given him opportunity. But opportunity without purpose was just wealth, and wealth without meaning was just numbers. He stopped at the Mudlark on his way home, standing in the darkness, looking at the wreck that had changed everything. Somewhere inside, in a hidden compartment he discovered by accident, there was still gold. Enough gold to last lifetimes, to buy empires, to reshape everything he touched. But the gold wasn't the real treasure anymore. The real treasure was the possibility it represented, the chance to matter, to change things, to become someone who left the world different than he found it. He thought about Sarah's quiet kindness, Jimmy's determination to learn, old Silas's warning about the weight of mattering, all the people on these docks who'd survived alongside him, who were still struggling while he'd found a way out. A plan formed in his mind, not the careful defensive plan of the past months. Something bigger, something that would use his wealth not just to enrich himself, but to lift others along the way. It was risky. It exposed him to criticism and resentment. It would make his life more complicated, not less. But maybe that was the point. Maybe real wealth wasn't about having more, it was about doing more. Tomorrow, he'd start implementing his partnership with Marcus. They'd begin modernizing the company, expanding operations, securing the future. But alongside that, he'd start something else. A workers' cooperative, a fund to help dock workers buy property, training programs for men like Jimmy whose bodies were wearing out. The gold would buy more than his own comfort. It would buy dignity for people who'd never had enough. And if that meant some of the gold went to purposes beyond his own enrichment, well, maybe his mother had been right about providence after all. Maybe fortunes came with responsibilities. And maybe the real test wasn't whether you could get rich, but what you did once you had the means to change things. The Mudlark creaked in the night breeze, her old timbers settling into the mud. She'd kept her secrets for 40 years. Now those secrets would reshape everything, not through hiding, but through the careful, deliberate use of wealth to transform lives beyond just his own. Tomorrow, a new chapter would begin, not just for Elias Cole, but for everyone whose life intersected with his newfound fortune. The partnership announcement hit Cyprus Landing like a stone dropped in still water, ripples spreading in every direction. Within hours, the entire waterfront knew that River Rat Cole was now part owner of the shipping company. By evening, speculation had turned into a dozen different theories about where his money had come from. Most people assumed he'd found more than brass in the Mudlark, but the guesses ranged wildly. Some said railroad bonds, others claimed silver bullion. A few whispered about pirate treasure, which was romantic but implausible this far from the ocean. Nobody guessed the truth, which was exactly what Elias needed. The transition wasn't smooth. Marcus's existing management team resented the intrusion, viewing Elias as an upstart who'd bought his way into authority he hadn't earned. Foremen who'd been taking orders from Marcus for decades balked at answering to a man who'd been shoveling trash for pennies just months earlier. Elias expected this. What he didn't expect was how deeply the resentment ran, or how creatively people could sabotage change while maintaining plausible deniability. Equipment went missing. Shipments were delayed through miscommunication. Workers showed up late or not at all, citing illnesses that seemed suspiciously timed to disrupt Elias's new operational procedures. Marcus, to his credit, backed Elias publicly, but privately, he made it clear that Elias needed to win over the men himself. "You can't buy respect," Marcus told him, during their first operational review. "You have to earn it, and these men don't care about your money. They care about whether you understand their work." So Elias did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He went back to the docks, not as an owner, but as a worker. For 2 weeks, he worked alongside the men loading cargo. He hauled crates, operated winches, mucked out warehouses, and did all the jobs he'd done for 60 years before the gold. But this time, he did them while also explaining his vision for the company's future. "The river trade is dying," he told a group of stevedores during a lunch break. "Not because we're doing anything wrong, but because railroads are faster and more reliable. We can't compete with that directly, but we can adapt." "How?" asked one of the older workers, a man named Dutch, who'd been skeptical of Elias from the start. "By becoming a coordination hub. We handle cargo transfers between river and rail. We specialize in goods that need temporary storage, customs processing, redistribution. We use the river for what it's good at, moving bulk goods short distances, and stop trying to compete with rails for long-haul freight. That means fewer jobs," Dutch said flatly. "In the old model, yes. But in the new model, we need more specialized workers. Inventory clerks, logistics coordinators, people who can read complex shipping manifests and optimize cargo routes." Elias paused. "I'm proposing training programs. We teach current workers new skills, pay them during training, transition them into positions that will exist in 10 years, not disappear." The skepticism didn't vanish, but it softened. Men who'd expected Elias to simply impose his will found instead someone willing to sweat alongside them and explain his reasoning. The breakthrough came during a crisis. A major shipment of machine parts needed to transfer from riverboat to rail within a 4-hour window, or the buyer would cancel the contract. The existing foreman, still resentful of Elias's authority, had scheduled insufficient workers to handle the transfer in time. When Elias discovered the problem 2 hours before the deadline, he didn't panic or blame. Instead, he grabbed a dolly and started moving crates himself. Then he called in every favor he'd built up over the past weeks, pulling workers from other tasks, reorganizing the warehouse on the fly, and personally operating the loading crane when the regular operator claimed he was too sick to work. They made the deadline with 11 minutes to spare. Afterward, Dutch approached Elias in the warehouse, both of them exhausted and soaked with sweat. "That crane work," Dutch said. "Where'd you learn to operate like that?" "I've worked every job on these docks at some point," Elias said, "including the ones nobody wants." Dutch studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Word of the incident spread. The narrative shifted. Elias wasn't just a lucky man who'd bought his way into power. He was someone who understood the work because he'd done it, who was willing to get his hands dirty when it mattered, who saw workers as assets to invest in rather than costs to minimize. The resistance didn't disappear entirely, but it eased enough for Elias to begin implementing real changes. He started the training programs he'd proposed, hiring a former rail logistics manager to teach workers how modern freight coordination worked. He bought new equipment that made dangerous jobs safer, reducing injuries and lost work time. He instituted a profit-sharing plan that gave workers a stake in the company's success. And quietly, using gold sold through Virgil Deacon's careful facilitation, he established a fund to help dock workers buy property. Nothing dramatic, small loans at fair interest rates, enough to turn renters into owners, to give families security they'd never had. Jimmy Potts was the first to benefit. Elias helped him buy a small house 2 streets back from the waterfront, a modest place but solid and his own. The gratitude in Jimmy's eyes made Elias uncomfortable, but also purposeful. "You didn't have to do this," Jimmy said, holding the deed like it might evaporate. "I remember what it's like to have nothing," Elias replied, "and I remember the people who helped me when they didn't have to. Sarah, giving me coffee when I couldn't pay. You, sharing your lunch even when you were hungry. Old Silas, teaching me which jobs to take and which bosses to avoid." He paused. "This isn't charity. It's investment in people I know will do right by it." As word of the fund spread, something shifted in how people viewed Elias. He wasn't just the former river rat who'd gotten lucky. He was becoming someone who used his luck to create opportunities for others. But success brought new problems. One afternoon, Marcus called Elias to his office, his expression grave. We have a situation. A railroad syndicate from St. Louis had made an offer to buy the Cyprus Landing Shipping Company. The price was substantial enough to make Marcus wealthy beyond his current comfortable status. And the offer came with a threat barely disguised as opportunity. Accept, or they'd build a competing facility that would drive the existing operation out of business. They're serious, Marcus said. They have the capital and the political connections to do it. If we refuse, they'll build a massive transfer hub 10 miles upriver, undercut our prices, and wait for us to collapse. Elias read through the offer documents carefully. The numbers were impressive, but the terms were predatory. The syndicate would keep current management for 6 months, then replace everyone with their own people. Workers would lose their positions, training programs would be cancelled, the profit-sharing plan would disappear. Everything he'd built would be dismantled for efficiency and profit margins. "What do you want to do?" Elias asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking older than his years. 10 years ago, I'd have fought them. But I'm tired, Elias. I've been fighting market changes, fighting debt, fighting the slow death of everything my grandfather built. This offer is a graceful exit. And the workers? The people who depend on this company? They'll find other work. That's how business works. Companies rise and fall. People adapt. Elias thought about Jimmy in his new house. Dutch learning logistics coordination. Sarah's smile when she heard about the profit-sharing plan. All the men and women who'd started to believe that maybe life could be better than just surviving. "I want to buy you out," he said. Marcus blinked. "What?" "You're 60%. I want to buy it. Full price, what the syndicate is offering for the whole company. You get your graceful exit, but the company stays independent." "You have that kind of money?" Marcus's skepticism was evident. "I can get it. From your mysterious salvage operation?" Marcus shook his head. "Elias, we're talking about $600,000. That's beyond lucky finds. That's serious wealth." "I found serious wealth," Elias said simply. "The question is whether you'd rather sell to me or to people who'll destroy everything we've built." Marcus was quiet for a long time, studying Elias with an intensity that felt like an examination. "If I sell to you," he finally said, "you'll need to disclose the source of your funding. Banks will require it. The syndicate will challenge it. You can't hide behind vague salvage claims at this level." Elias had known this moment would come. The moment when staying hidden became impossible. "I'm prepared for that." "Are you?" Marcus leaned forward. "Because once you declare significant Confederate gold holdings, every treasure hunter, tax agent, and legal shark in 5 states will be asking questions. Your life will never be private again. Then it won't be private, but it'll be mine. And this company will be mine to run the way it should be run, for the benefit of people who work it, not just people who own it." Marcus smiled slightly. "You've changed more than I thought possible. River Rat Cole becoming a radical capitalist with socialist sympathies. Your mother would be proud." "My mother would tell me I'm being reckless." "You are being reckless. But maybe that's what this moment needs." Marcus pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Let me draw up terms. We'll need lawyers, accountants, documentation. It'll take weeks to finalize. And you'll need to start the disclosure process immediately." "I understand." As Elias left the office, he felt the weight of what he'd just committed to. Full disclosure meant admitting to 40 years of hidden Confederate gold. It meant legal battles, publicity, scrutiny from authorities who might try to claim the treasure belonged to the government or required special taxation. But it also meant no more hiding, no more carefully managed half-truths, no more living in fear that someone would discover what he'd found. That evening, he went to the Mudlark one final time before the disclosure. He stood on the rotting deck, looking at the vessel that had transformed his life. Tomorrow, he'd begin the legal process that would make the gold official. Lawyers would document everything, accountants would assess value, agents would verify authenticity. The secret that had protected him for months would become public knowledge, and he'd have to face whatever consequences came with that revelation. But as he looked across the river at the docks, the warehouses, the town that had ignored him for 63 years, Elias felt something unexpected, not fear, but anticipation. He'd spent his whole life being invisible, insignificant, safely hidden in poverty. Now he was choosing to be seen, to matter, to use his wealth not just for himself, but for the people and place that had shaped him. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and it was exactly what his life had been building toward, even when he didn't know it. Tomorrow, everything would change again, but this time, the change was his choice, made on his terms, for purposes bigger than his own comfort. He climbed down from the mudlark and walked back toward town, ready for whatever came next. The disclosure process began on a cold December morning, with lawyers from Memphis filling Marcus's office. Elias had hired his own representation, a firm that specialized in historical property claims and complex estate matters. They came prepared with documentation, precedent cases, and a strategy designed to establish clear ownership before any challenges could take root. The lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Morris, laid out the situation plainly. Confederate Treasury gold falls into a legal gray area, she explained. The Confederacy dissolved, so their claim is void. The Union never formally seized this specific cash, so federal claim is questionable. Your purchase of the vessel was legal and documented. The gold was discovered on property you owned. By any reasonable interpretation, it's yours. But, Elias prompted, hearing the unspoken qualification, but the amount changes everything. We're not talking about a few coins or bars. Based on your preliminary inventory, we're discussing approximately $8 million in current gold value. Catherine paused to let that sink in. That kind of wealth attracts attention. The federal government might argue the gold should be considered unclaimed treasury assets. Local authorities might want a percentage, and then there are the descendants of whoever originally hid it. They could claim hereditary rights. What do you recommend? We go public aggressively, file ownership claims in federal and state courts simultaneously, get ahead of the narrative. Show that you've been paying taxes on income derived from systematic gold sales, that you haven't been hiding assets, just managing them prudently. Catherine pulled out a thick folder. We've prepared a complete disclosure package. Financial records, sale documentation, the original bill of sale for the Mudlark, historical research on Confederate Treasury movements during the war's final weeks. The preparation was thorough, professional, and completely terrifying. Elias signed papers that would make his discovery public knowledge within 48 hours. There was no going back. The news broke on a Wednesday. The Memphis Appeal ran the story on the front page. Local man discovers Civil War fortune in derelict steamboat. By afternoon, journalists from 3 states had descended on Cypress Landing. By evening, the story had reached newspapers in New York and Chicago. Elias stayed in his shack. He decided not to move until the legal situation stabilized, and watched through his window as reporters gathered on the street. Some knocked on his door. He didn't answer. Catherine had advised him to say nothing until the legal filings were complete, and they had clear strategy for media engagement. But isolation didn't stop the speculation. Newspapers printed wild theories about how much gold there was, what it might be worth, whether Elias had any legal right to it. Editorial writers debated the ethics of keeping Confederate assets versus returning them to government custody. Treasure hunters began arriving in town, convinced there must be more gold hidden in other wrecks along the river. The pressure was intense and unrelenting. Elias felt it like a physical weight, the constant awareness that thousands of people now knew his name, his story, his sudden wealth. Privacy, which he'd had in abundance even when he had nothing else, became impossible. On the 4th day, the federal government filed a claim. Catherine had predicted this. She called Elias to her temporary office in the River House Hotel, spread out the government's filing, and walked him through it. They're arguing that Confederate Treasury assets should revert to the Union government as successor state. It's a weak argument. Legally, the precedent doesn't support it, but it's politically popular. Makes them look like they're protecting public interest. How long will the legal fight take? Months, possibly years. But here's the good news. While the ownership is in dispute, you can't sell more gold, but you also can't be forced to give it up. It becomes frozen assets until the courts decide, which means I can't use it to buy out Marcus's share of the company, Elias finished. Catherine nodded. Not directly, but there are other approaches. The solution came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the government filing, a banker from Street Louis arrived in Cypress Landing requesting a meeting with Elias. His name was Theodore Wright, and he represented a consortium of private investors interested in what he called creative financing arrangements. They met in Catherine's office. Wright was a precise man in his 50s, carrying a leather portfolio and an air of calculated confidence. "Mr. Cole," he began, "your legal situation is complex but not unusual. Historical asset claims take time to resolve. However, the eventual outcome seems favorable based on precedent and the strength of your ownership documentation." He opened his portfolio. "My clients are prepared to offer you a loan secured against your gold holdings. Not the full value that would be imprudent given the legal uncertainty, but approximately 60%. That gives you immediate liquidity while the courts deliberate." Elias exchanged a glance with Catherine. "What's the interest rate?" 8% annually, with no payment due until the legal claim is resolved. If the courts rule against you and you lose the gold, the loan is forgiven. If you win, you repay principal and accrued interest. We're essentially betting on the legal outcome alongside you. It was a clever structure. Wright's clients would profit handsomely if Elias won his case, but they also absorbed the risk if he lost. For Elias, it meant access to capital now, when he needed it, to secure Marcus's share of the company before the railroad syndicate forced a decision. "How much could you loan against my holdings?" Wright consulted his papers. "Based on your attorney's preliminary inventory, we could extend $4 million within 2 weeks of agreement." $4 million. More than enough to buy out Marcus, fight off the syndicate challenge, and establish the company on terms that protected workers and community. It wouldn't be his money, not yet, but it would be money he could use. Catherine leaned forward. "We'd need to review your loan documents carefully, ensure there are no hidden clauses or problematic terms." "Of course," Wright agreed. "I'd expect nothing less." The negotiation lasted 6 hours. Catherine found and eliminated 3 problematic clauses, negotiated better terms on early repayment, and added protections against the loan being sold to third parties who might be less sympathetic to Elias's situation. When they finally signed the agreement, Elias felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He'd just committed to potentially millions in debt. But he'd also secured the means to complete his transformation from river rat Cole to someone who could reshape his world on his own terms. The buyout of Marcus Webb's share happened in the same office where Elias had once been called to be reminded of his place. But now, the dynamics had shifted completely. Marcus sat across from Elias as an equal, both men flanked by lawyers and accountants, negotiating the transfer of an empire that had defined Cypress Landing for 3 generations. Marcus reviewed the offer terms one final time. $600,000 cash, transferred within 30 days, full release from all liabilities and obligations, a consulting role for 2 years if he wanted it, paid separately. "You're overpaying," Marcus said quietly. "I'm paying fair value," Elias corrected. "You built something worth preserving. That's worth compensating properly." Marcus signed the papers with a hand that trembled slightly, not from age or illness, but from the weight of ending something that had been his entire identity. When he finished, he set down the pen and looked at Elias with an expression that mixed relief and regret. "You know what's strange?" Marcus said. "I spent my whole life looking down on men like you, men with nothing, scrambling for scraps. I thought wealth and power came from birth, from inheritance, from being smart enough to hold on to what your family built." He gestured at the signed documents. "But you proved me wrong. Real power comes from being willing to risk everything for what matters. You're giving me too much credit. I got lucky. Luck gave you opportunity. What you did with it, that was choice." Marcus stood, extending his hand. "Make this company into something I couldn't. Make it matter for people beyond just the owners." They shook hands, and Elias felt the symbolic weight of the moment. The man who'd once called him River Rat, who'd mocked his $2 purchase, who'd represented everything Elias could never have, was now passing that power to him willingly. The railroad syndicate responded to the ownership change by escalating their threats. They sent representatives to meet with Elias, confident they could intimidate a former dockworker more easily than they'd intimidated Marcus Webb. They were wrong. The meeting took place in the shipping company's main office. 3 men in expensive suits sat across from Elias, projecting the casual arrogance of people who'd always gotten what they wanted through pressure and money. "Mr. Cole," the lead negotiator began, "we respect your recent acquisition, but our offer stands. Sell to us now for $800,000, or watch as we build a facility that makes yours obsolete." Elias let the threat hang in the air for a moment. Then he pulled out his own documents. "I've done some research on your syndicate. You're leveraged heavily on railroad expansion bonds. Your profit margins depend on maintaining certain shipping volumes through consolidated hubs." He slid papers across the desk. "I've also been in talks with 4 other independent shipping companies along the river. We're forming a cooperative freight network. Combined, we can offer better rates and more flexible service than any single large hub." The negotiator's confidence flickered. "A cooperative of small operations can't compete with our infrastructure. Maybe not on infrastructure, but we can compete on relationships, local knowledge, and flexibility. We know these rivers, these towns, these customers in ways a distant syndicate never will." Elias leaned forward. "More importantly, I've secured contracts with 3 major manufacturers who prefer working with local operations. They'll pay slightly more to avoid being dependent on a monopoly provider." This was the gamble. Elias had spent the past weeks using his newfound capital and credibility to build alliances, secure contracts, and create a network that could resist the syndicate's pressure. Not by matching their size, but by being different enough to matter. The negotiator studied the documents, his expression shifting from confidence to calculation. "You've been busy. I learned a long time ago that survival means adapting faster than circumstances change. The river trade might be dying, but coordination services are growing. Your syndicate wants to own that growth. I want to make sure it serves the people who built these waterways, not just the people who have the most money." The meeting ended without agreement, but also without threats. The syndicate representatives left promising to reconsider their approach, which Elias understood to mean they'd look for easier targets elsewhere. That evening, Elias stood on the docks watching the sun set over the Mississippi. The mudlark was visible in the distance, still rotting in her mudbank, still holding the remainder of her hidden cargo. But she wasn't his secret anymore. She was part of a public story, a discovery that had transformed not just his life, but the lives of everyone connected to this waterfront. Sarah appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without speaking, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the river flow past in colors of amber and gold. "Jimmy bought a house," she finally said. "Dutch enrolled in the logistics training program. Old Silas told me yesterday that for the first time in 50 years he thinks maybe the docks have a future." "Maybe they do," Elias said. "Because of you. Because of gold that was hidden for 40 years, waiting for someone foolish enough to buy a worthless wreck." He sipped his coffee. "I was just the fool who happened to be there." Sarah smiled. "You were the fool who knew what to do with what you found. That's different than just being lucky. They stood together until full darkness fell, and the lamplights along the waterfront created a constellation of small glows against the night. Somewhere in the distance, a steamboat whistle sounded, lonely and evocative, a reminder of what this river had been and what it might yet become. Elias thought about his mother, about Father Sullivan's words regarding responsibility, about the long journey from invisibility to significance. The gold had given him means, but purpose had come from remembering who he'd been and choosing to use his wealth to ensure others didn't have to stay there. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he first pried open that hidden compartment, but it was better than anything he could have planned. Richer in ways that had nothing to do with money, and more meaningful than mere comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The legal battle over the gold would continue. The cooperative freight network would need careful management. The syndicate might find new ways to pressure them. But tonight, standing on the docks where he'd spent 63 years being nobody, Elias Cole felt something he'd never experienced before. Not just success, but significance. Not just wealth, but worth. The river flowed past, indifferent and eternal, carrying its secrets and its commerce toward distant destinations. And Elias stood beside it, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, ready for whatever came next. 6 months after the buyout, the federal court ruled in Elias's favor. The judge's decision was thorough and unambiguous. The gold had been legally salvaged from a vessel Elias had purchased through proper channels. Confederate treasury claims had dissolved with the Confederacy itself. No hereditary claims could be established without clear documentation of original ownership. The treasure belonged to Elias Cole, subject to standard capital gains taxation on any sales. The ruling made headlines again, though with less hysteria than the initial discovery. Elias paid his taxes, repaid Theodore Wright's loan with interest, and found himself in the strange position of being genuinely wealthy in a way that was now completely legal and documented. But wealth, he'd learned, was just a tool. What mattered was what you built with it. The Cyprus Landing Shipping Company thrived under his leadership. The cooperative freight network he'd established grew to include 12 independent operations along the Mississippi and its tributaries. They didn't dominate the market, but they carved out a sustainable niche in specialized services, local knowledge, and flexible customer relationships that large syndicates couldn't match. The worker training programs expanded. Men who'd spent their lives doing back-breaking labor learned logistics, accounting, and coordination skills that would keep them employed as the river trade continued evolving. The profit-sharing plan meant that company success translated into better lives for the people doing the actual work. The Property Purchase Fund helped 37 families buy homes in the first year alone. Renters became owners. Transient workers put down roots. The waterfront community, which had been slowly dying, found new life. Elias moved out of his tar paper shack and into a modest house 3 streets back from the docks. Nothing ostentatious, he'd learned that real security came from community respect, not isolation behind walls. His neighbors were the same dock workers and shop owners who'd known him as River Rat. They still called him Elias, still stopped by for coffee and conversation, still treated him as one of them despite the wealth that separated them on paper. Sarah Brennan became a frequent visitor. Their relationship developed slowly, built on years of mutual respect and the kind of understanding that comes from surviving similar hardships. They never married, both were too old and set in their ways for that kind of formality, but they spent evenings together, sharing meals and conversation, and the comfortable companionship of people who didn't need to pretend to be anything other than what they were. Jimmy Potts took over management of the worker training program, bringing the same determination to teaching that he'd once brought to dock labor. His missing fingers became a teaching tool, a reminder of why learning safer, more sustainable skills mattered. Under his leadership, the program became a model that other companies studied and copied. Old Silas passed away in his sleep one autumn night, sitting on his favorite piling, watching the river he'd observed for 8 decades. Elias paid for the funeral and discovered that Silas had no living relatives, no estate, nothing but the clothes he wore and a pocket watch that had stopped working 20 years earlier. Elias had the watch repaired and kept it on his desk. A reminder that some people spent their whole lives watching the world change without ever having the means to change with it. Marcus Webb took his consulting role seriously for the contracted 2 years, then gradually withdrew to enjoy retirement with his family. He and Elias maintained a cordial relationship built on mutual respect for what each had brought to their partnership. They'd never be friends, exactly too much history, too many differences, but they'd become something more valuable, colleagues who understood each other's worth. The mudlark remained in her mudbank, gradually dissolving back into the landscape that had held her for so long. Elias had the remaining gold removed and properly vaulted, but he left the old steamboat where she lay. Some suggested salvaging her for historical preservation, but Elias refused. She'd served her purpose. Let her rest. Father Sullivan visited Elias regularly, never mentioning providence or responsibility directly, but always seeming satisfied when Elias shared news about the worker programs or the housing fund. The old priest died 2 years after the gold discovery, and Elias endowed a scholarship in his name for children of dockworkers seeking education beyond what the local schools could provide. The transformation of Cypress Landing happened gradually enough that residents didn't fully notice until they looked back and compared where they were to where they'd been. The waterfront still struggled. Dying industries don't reverse their decline just because one man got lucky, but it struggled with dignity now, with hope, with the sense that the future held possibilities beyond just slower deterioration. Elias celebrated his 65th birthday, surrounded by people who'd once ignored him and now called him friend. The gathering was held in the new community center he'd funded, a modest building that served as meeting space, training facility, and social hub. Jimmy gave a toast. Sarah baked a cake. Dutch presented him with a plaque that read, "To the man who proved that finding treasure means nothing compared to knowing what to do with it." That night, Elias walked down to the river alone, as he often did when he needed to think. He stood on the dock where he'd spent so many years hauling cargo for pennies and looked out at the dark water flowing past. His mother had believed in providence. Father Sullivan had believed in responsibility. Elias had come to believe in something simpler. That opportunity was random, but what you did with it revealed character. The gold could have bought him a mansion, a life of ease in some distant city, isolation from the poverty he'd known for 6 decades. Instead, it had bought him community, purpose, and the profound satisfaction of using wealth to create dignity for others. He thought about the younger version of himself who'd spent $2 on a rotting wreck because he was too stubborn to let Marcus Webb have the last word. That decision, made from pride and spite and desperate hope, had changed everything, not just for him, but for hundreds of people whose lives intersected with his own. The river flowed past, patient and eternal, carrying new cargo and old secrets toward the Gulf. Somewhere in the darkness, the mudlark sat in her mudbank, her boards dissolving into sludge, her story fading into legend. But the impact of what she'd hidden, the fortune that had been waiting 40 years for someone to find it, would echo forward through generations. Elias Cole had been invisible for 63 years. Now he was visible, significant, someone who mattered in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how he'd chosen to use the opportunity that chance had provided. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything a man could hope for, not just to survive, but to matter, not just to escape poverty, but to lift others along the way. The river kept flowing. The stars wheeled overhead, and Elias stood on the docks where his story had begun, grateful for every hard year that had taught him what truly mattered when fortune finally arrived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to serve the community that had shaped him. But tonight he simply stood and remembered and felt the deep satisfaction of a life transformed not just by wealth, but by the wisdom to use it well.